When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back. This is the HTML All Things Podcast. This episode is going to be about the top 5 code editors for web developers. Now, I'm an old man. I don't really use much. I use VS Code, so I mean, that's pretty standard, but I use Notepad++ still quite a bit, mostly as like a dumping ground. Like I quickly like dump a bit of code in there, or I'll like mess around with it in there, or things like that. If I'm doing a big project, will use VS Code. That's about as far as I go, though. And so Mike has actually a list here, including VS Code at number 1, but we're going to be talking about Cursor, we're going to talk about Vim, and we're going to be talking about WebStorm, Zed, things like that. So if you've ever wanted to be like, hey, what are these other code editors like? Come check out this episode, I guess. Although I guess you're already listening to it, so. Anyway, if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go check us out on that Patreon, leave a review or rating on our podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. That sounded like I was talking like an auctioneer a little bit. I started really talking fast, so I just let it go. It felt good.
Heck yeah.
I missed my calling. I should have been an auctioneer, and I should have specifically been on Storage Wars Canada.
I feel like you've said those lines like hundreds of times now, and it's just become a part of who you are.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, like I feel like hopefully you don't have it, but if you ever have dementia, that would probably still be around in your brain somehow. Like you'd just be all non-lucid and just all of a sudden, all right, share this with your friends or something stupid, something ridiculous like that.
Now, I do have actually a ridiculous small story about Storage Wars Canada. So I was at an antique show. This is ridiculous. So I was at an antique show and I was walking around. It was like an outdoor market. And one of the guys from Storage Wars Canada was there. And it was the guy with the hat. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm making a joke about Storage Wars Canada because I'm in Canada. I've watched Storage Wars Canada like once. Like it's not great. At least in my opinion, I didn't like it too much. I like the original better. But I haven't watched that in years either. But anyway, so I'm walking around and I kind of recognized him, and I was with a buddy and he definitely recognized him because he's watched like quite a bit of Storage Wars Canada. He's like, oh, it's that guy from Storage Wars Canada or whatever. And he's like chatting with people stuff, but he's like legitimately selling stuff, presumably from storage lockers at this antique show. And we like leave his booth and we're at someone else's booth down the row. And we're talking about that guy, how it's like kind of crazy that he's like actually in the business and, you know, whatever, just kind of talking about that. And the vendor at the booth that we were at overhears us, and he's like, "Oh, you talking about that guy, the guy with the cowboy hat?" And he's like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Man," he's like, "What a clown show," or something. He said. I was like, "Oh, like I don't know, man. Like I don't watch the show too much." He's like, "Man," he's like, "To be honest with you," he's like, "the only thing missing from that goofy ass situation is his goofy ass son."
Jeez.
Was like, again, sir, I don't know who these people are. And he just left. The vendor just walked away. He just really wanted to tell us that. So I was laughing pretty good that day.
Some jealousy there.
Yeah, some Storage Wars Canada jealousy. But anyway, this is not a Storage Wars podcast.
I guess I gotta leave then. That's all I know. All I know is Storage Wars, Matt. So like, what? There's no point in me being here. Like, what are these code editors we're talking about?
Thank you for taking over the transition, because I didn't know how to transition from Storage Wars to Visual Studio Code. So, Mike, you've done the transition. Please take it away before before we start talking about Storage Wars again.
100%. Okay, so this episode, what are we going to talk about? We're going to be talking about the code editors. I think it's a pretty relevant topic right now. There's a lot of discussion going on all the different social medias. Everyone's kind of talking about the new AI editors, and we will talk about that a little bit, especially how it kind of integrates with the different other options of editors. Like I think every editor that I'm going to mention here will have some form of AI assistance that you can add to it in greater or lesser form. So there's a lot of talk about that, but there's also a lot of talk about like efficiency, setting up a productive environment, getting to know an editor very well and the benefits of that. And like, when do you switch editors? I do want to kind of touch on that as well as we're going through this, because in my own personal experience right now, I'm leading a team of engineers and we're kind of open to like whatever editors out there. I'm seeing people switch editors like every week. And that's not an exaggeration. These are like professional developers. Everything's moving at lightning speed. Everyone's trying out new things. So it's a really interesting prospect. And whether you lose productivity or not, there's probably some positives and negatives on that part. But it does seem to be in the zeitgeist. Like, people are trying new things, whereas maybe before, with VS Code kind of becoming complacent a little bit in its dominance, it wasn't happening as much, right? So I think it's a cool thing to talk about. There's a lot that I've tried. Some of the ones that I'm going to be talking about, I haven't done too in depth. One of them is WebStorm. I haven't used WebStorm for a while. I think I used it a little bit when we were first starting out as web developers, because it was like a fully featured IDE. But overall, it's something that I've kind of mostly just read about and gotten people's opinions on. But all the other ones I have tried to a certain extent and gotten some pretty good results with. They're all solid choices. Let me say that from the start too. None of these are going to be a mistake. You can do the job with a Notepad. With Notepad especially, it has a lot of plugins and stuff like that. Yes. Now, would I ever recommend a web developer in today's landscape to ever use Notepad? Absolutely not. The amount of features that you kind of need to power some of the intelligent autocomplete or the type checking, or, check like all the different kind of cross-functional compatibilities with like being able to see where a file is linked into another file. Like if you import something, being able to control or command click that import and going to the right file. All of those niceties are because of these editors, right? And then the language servers that are built into some of these editors, or as add-ons or as plugins, whatever, that allow you to have all this really rich experience dealing with JavaScript or TypeScript or PHP, whatever. They give you that kind of powerful tooling for you to be able to write code faster and easier and safer, right? So that's the main purpose of these editors, is just making it easier for you to create more robust code and giving you as many tools as you need and as little as tools as you need to be productive. With that, I want to kind of jump right in to the first one I'm going to mention, which is Visual Studio Code, VS Code. This is, I think, arguably, or not even arguably, potentially the most popular code editor for web developers. I think it still is the most popular one, even though there's a lot of noise about all the other ones that I'll mention. This one kind of gained dominance because, due to its open nature, due to the fact that Microsoft was the backer here, created Visual Studio non-code. So there's two different Visual Studios. There might even be more. Two ones that I know about. There's Visual Studio, which is the fully robust editing experience. Typically, you can do everything you need to do in it. Like, you can do web development inside of Visual Studio, not Visual Studio Code. But the problem with Visual Studio is that it's really like a massive tool chain. There's a ton of built-in features. There's a ton of refactoring tools. There's a ton of tools. It's pretty resource intensive. It is fairly feature intensive, so it's a little bit overwhelming sometimes. And it's really not fully suited for web development, in my opinion. It's more of a, hey, you need C#, you need Java, like something that requires a little bit more tool chain stuff, right? Like, you need to compile stuff, you need to build it to a certain binary. That is where you need to reach for a more sophisticated editor like Visual Studio. But for a lighter workflow that is more web development related, Visual Studio Code is kind of the de facto choice right now, right? So what is it? A free and open source editor developed by Microsoft. It's kind of super versatile. It's open source. It's extensive, like, because of its prolonged dominance since its release. The amount of community extensions and features that have been built into it is, I don't think, surpassed by any other editor other than maybe arguably NeoVim. But even then, I'm pretty sure that the plugin support for VS Code is higher than NeoVim. And it's just something that's been battle tested a heck of a lot for all the different workflows that are required in web development. That's really its biggest selling point, as far as I understand it. It has some like interesting things built into it. It has an integrated terminal, which personally I used for a really long time until I got a little bit nerdy on terminals. And I'm probably going to have an episode dedicated to like the top 5 terminals at some point. So stay tuned for that. But essentially, it's a kind of one-stop shop for you because not only does it have a terminal, it has a debugger built in. So it allows you to like connect to a virtual Chrome window or like a separate Chrome window and be able to debug directly inside of VS Code without having to go to like a debug console. I've used it. It's okay. But in certain cases, it's fine. In other cases, I prefer kind of like the browser debugging method where you just set the breakpoints or just go to the console there. But regardless, what it allows you to have is a fully rich environment of all the tools you will need to be able to do your web development project, right? And it also runs on Windows, Mac OS, Linux, allowing you to take all those tools. It has a sync function built in, so whatever functionality, whatever like extensions you have, whatever settings you have set, if you're using multiple computers, it'll sync across those computers. It has a bunch of built-in functionality for like stuff like dev containers, which is a way to develop inside of like a VM on your system, which is kind of an important topic that I probably should cover in a security episode. But essentially, the built-in support for dev containers allows you to spin up a dev container, which is essentially like a little Docker container, put the editor inside there, put your entire development environment inside of this container, and then whatever you install inside the container, including like node modules, any sort of package, any sort of application, whatever you compile there, is limited to the scope of that container. So if, for instance, you're worried about installing a malicious package and you want to test it out, spinning up a really quick dev container inside of using VS Code will allow you to test that package, even if there is like a malicious actor or a malicious container in there or a malicious package. It will only have access to what that container is in. So it won't have access to your computer, won't have access to anything that you have locally in your file storage. It will only have access to like the files that you pulled from Git inside that dev container. Cool feature. I like the first-party support that VS Code provides for it, and especially when you're like in a security-conscious environment. Some of the cons, like it's not perfect in any way. I've noticed a few cons, and I'll talk about that in a second, but like resource usage can be very high. It is I believe, Electron-based application, so it is kind of limited to JavaScript single threading. Not the greatest for an IDE, but for the most part, not really noticeable. Like it's still very fast. I haven't noticed it other than when you have like a memory leak or you have an issue with like an extension that causes some sort of a memory leak and then that causes your computer to slow down and stuff like that. That can happen. Not super frequent, but absolutely can. The other con is frequent updates. So if you're looking for like a super stable product that's been around for a long time and hasn't changed, arguably, like, yeah, I could see that being something that's cool. Like, again, Notepad hasn't changed in a really long time, although it did have an update recently-ish. I think with Windows 11, Notepad got like an upgrade. But that's, an option for you, I guess, if you don't want something to update consistently. But for me personally, I kind of like the frequent updates because it brings with it new features. It brings with it new performance improvements, but it also, the negative side, can bring bugs. And one thing that has happened to me with VS Code, and one of the reasons I actually started looking around, was essentially on my MacBook with VS Code installed, I started noticing my battery draining like, I don't know, 5% every 10, 15 minutes, which is crazy because I'm on an M series MacBook. And the battery usually lasts for like 8 to 12 hours. And all of a sudden I saw it dying in like a few hours. So essentially I looked it up and I saw that, hey, VS Code is using a ridiculous amount of battery. There was a memory leak and I couldn't figure it out for a while. At some point it was fixed with a update, but again, an update probably brought in this memory leak. It was a really, really specific memory leak that only a few people triggered, so they couldn't fix it right away. Those are the kinds of negatives that can come from these rapidly developing products. You can be working all of a sudden normally, and all of a sudden you can just be flipping a switch and your battery's draining like crazy. So something to keep in mind, but easily solvable by just keeping up with the change log, keeping up with the updates, going back a version. It's open source. You can always go back to whatever version you want. Not a big deal. And eventually I did solve it, but in that kind of interim process, I was like, I wonder what's out there.
I do want to say one thing about it too is I do use VS Code on occasion over the years, and even though you mentioned like there's Visual Studio, which is kind of more fully fledged, there's like lots and lots of features. I almost feel like VS Code feels like that a little bit, depending on what it is you're doing, because you've absolutely like shared your screen and have done something in front of me where I'm like, hey, I didn't even know that was possible in VS Code. Like it's definitely one of those programs that, like many other programs, I'm sure, that have so many buttons and so many options and settings and preferences and features, and just the list just keeps going on, that you don't necessarily look through everything. It's just sort of like, okay, how do I get started? Where do I, add my project? How do I open files, close files, things like that? And once you kind of sort yourself out that way, then it kind of feels like you, at least for me, it's like I kind of stop exploring to an extent a little bit, which I don't know if it's good or bad or whatever, but it's like you can use version control inside of VS Code, things like that. And like I wasn't doing that originally, right? I was just sort of like using VS Code, then I would like go and use my version control, be like, okay, push these changes, update this, fetch this, blah blah blah, whatever I'm doing. Meanwhile, then you were just like, oh, you could just quickly do it in here. I think you were compiling something at one point, and you had the little like compiling terminal like docked inside of VS Code at some point as well. And it's like I just never even thought of that being a thing. So like even though VS Code is sort of like a slimmer version that's kind of, I guess, better for web development, I'm sure other types of development too, but web development for sure, than Visual Studio full or whatever you want to call it. It's still very fully featured. Like this isn't like a light version necessarily. This is very much just like a different product.
That's 100% true. And it is very, very fully featured, especially when you bring in the extension marketplace. Like there's an extension for everything you could possibly imagine. And that's part of what you're probably seeing as well, Matt, where like I bring in something and a lot of the times it is just an extension that I downloaded. So yeah, I think it starts off as being simpler, but absolutely you can add as much as you want to it to create a more rich environment. The Visual Studio comparison is like it starts off already kind of amped up. And like there's already so much going on that like you really need to benefit from what's going on right away to be able to see the benefit of that kind of Visual Studio experience. Whereas I like with anything I try, with anything I start, I like to start off super simple and then bring in one thing at a time that I need, rather than like, hey, here's 15,000 different features. If you don't use them, you're slowing down your computer anyway. So what's the point? Anyway, so like, I'd rather just start a little bit more bare bones and bring stuff in as I need it, and then learn those things and then move on to the next thing, learn that thing, forget the other thing that I didn't need to learn or that I'm not using anymore, and move through my editing experience like that. Yeah, it's just, I like that approach. And VS Code, when it first came out, was a way more cut down version of what we're seeing today. Like it still had a lot of these features that I talked about, like the terminal, I think was like a day one feature, which was a really cool addition, especially for someone that's really not terminal savvy. Just having that terminal there that's kind of tied to the exact location where your code is running, I found to be really cool to like ramp up on how to use a terminal. Having said that, again, like as you learn a little bit more, you're like, oh, well, this terminal is actually not that good. It's a little bit slow. It's a little bit limited, not as many extensions work in it and stuff like that. So eventually you're probably going to reach for a terminal if you're using it enough. But I love the aspect of like, again, the gradual learning and allowing you to kind of like find the features when you need them rather than throwing them in your face with 15,000 different panes that appear at you with VS Code or Visual Studio, I should say.
It kind of sucks too. It's kind of like when you're on WordPress or something like that, and you go to install a plugin, and the plugin is like a suite of features where it's like, we have 250 features, and it's like, man, I'm here just to bring in an RSS feed. Like I'm using one of your 200 plus features. There's a lot of just stuff sitting on my server now that, I mean, it's just sitting there. It's not being used, and I have no plan to use it either. So it's nice to be able to like slowly grab at features as needed.
Heck yeah, exactly. One feature that VS Code does have, and I'll talk about kind of this with every editor, is a first-party support for GitHub Copilot, which is the AI autocomplete tool. This was the first AI autocomplete tool that I ever used. It came out, I think, in like 2021, I want to say, like really early on in the LLM space. I think it was the first like LLM interface I've ever used where it did some sort of natural language completion. It blew me away back then. It still blows me away. The difference here is that its features got a lot more robust, but other editors came out and other other extensions came out that started to become on par and then overtake it. So if 2021 to like 2023, it was the best in its space for a considerable amount of time. Now it's very arguably either middle pack or even lower end, versus something like the next one that we're going to talk about, which is Cursor. Now, having said that, that's the first party support for like what's built into VS Code. And GitHub Copilot, by the way, you can have it for, I believe it's free for a certain amount of usage for anyone that uses VS Code. So you don't have to pay anything to use it, which is really, really cool. And it has chat built in now where you can chat to your code base, which is awesome. I talked about that in a previous episode. Really, really powerful feature. So it's catching up to the ones that have replaced it, quote unquote, but it's still not, in my opinion, at the same level. So they just haven't put enough effort into it. The other things that VS Code does have is that, again, the extension marketplace allows you to download any other AI app, essentially, or an AI integration. There's one that I used recently for when I was testing out my local AI capabilities on my MacBook. I have a MacBook M4 with like 48 gigs of RAM, so I can run some models locally. And with that, there's an extension on there that allows you to use like an Ollama endpoint on your MacBook locally, and then use that as your chat, like for your code base. And that was really, really good. Honestly, it was a really cool way to interact with like a local LLM. And all I had to do was install an extension. I'll have the extension. I don't have it on hand, but I'll have the extension in the show notes, as well as maybe some other extension suggestions in the show notes as well for VS Code. And this perfectly transitions to Cursor, because the extensions that I'm going to list for VS Code can apply directly to Cursor, because one of the advantages of VS Code is that it's open source. And what people have done now, or companies have done essentially, is take that open source, fork it, and start their own IDEs. And the difference with Cursor being still very similar to VS Code. So anything I said in the positive realm of VS Code applies directly to Cursor. What it adds on top is more integration to the AI side of things. So it's very much deeply integrated to its chat and its autocomplete functionality, more so than VS Code was more of like a, hey, let's put GitHub Copilot on top of this, right? And then have that work like pretty much on top. Whereas Cursor was built with like a Copilot, but its own Cursor autocomplete built in. So that's the difference. So it very much feels like a first party element, like when you first start to use it, it just starts to feel like, oh, this knows my entire code base. I can bring on all this context here. I can talk to it about specific lines of a specific file rather than a whole file. I can talk to it across different files. There's just so many little features that they've added that make it easier for you to use the AI to adjust your code in very granular ways. And that's a really big positive when I was doing that switch from VS Code to Cursor, right? That was the thing that pushed me to the edge, is like, I wanted the ability to go like, hey, here's like lines 50 to 60 of this file. You could pretty much say that in natural language. Can you please go through that, check those lines, or you can highlight those lines and like hit Command L or Control L, and it'll like promptly create like a little instance of chat with all that context selected. And then you can talk to that specific function directly and be like, hey, can you optimize this? Can you refactor it? And you can be like, hey, I have this function that I've highlighted here. Can you go into this other file and see if you can merge these two functions and put them into a separate file? And it'll literally like take both those functions, create a new file for you in your file tree, put those in the file, change all your imports to be able to do that. Like that's the level of granularity and auto completion that you can do with something like Cursor. Now, GitHub Copilot might have added some of those features by the time you hear this episode, honestly, because it's moving that quickly. So there's other competitors out there. Windsurf is another one that has a lot of what I'm going to be talking about built in. The reason that I'm only going to mention Cursor in the AI wars kind of IDE is because that's the one I have most context with. And a lot of these editors are really copying each other like nonstop. And that's a good thing. Like, we want them to copy each other. We want them to innovate, copy, and have this like really competitive landscape, because that's going to benefit us. And that's what's happening right now in the code editor world. There's a massive amount of competition that hasn't happened in a really long time, ever since the release of VS Code, essentially. And we are seeing the benefit of that as developers, with really cool features being built out essentially on a week-to-week basis.
I have a bit of a question here. So and this is like on and off topic. So like the AI tool space, especially for developers, IDEs we're talking about today, are like going like crazy, like you said. Like they're all competing, they're adding features, they're manipulating things, they're changing things to, kind of compete with each other to try to be better than each other. The list goes on. My question is that I guess, and we don't have numbers to say this, but just for discussion's sake, is do we see this anywhere else? Like in the industry? So like AI has always been advertised as sort of a general tool, right? It's like Copilot, not GitHub Copilot, but Copilot is just, I mean, a consumer AI, I guess you could call it. And so the question is, it's like, are we seeing that level of competition anywhere else? Because like, yeah, like AI is rapidly moving and things like that. But we've even heard, I think it was the Google CEO say something like the low hanging fruit is kind of gone. It's kind of done. It's been completed. So like, where are we at, do you think? Like, is AI really going to become more of like a thing for developers? Because like this seems crazy to me, where we have like things that are old hat, right? Like Vim has been around for a very, very long time. VS Code has been around for a great number of years. Those are just two examples, but and then we just have like things come up and they're just like, hey, look, everyone's using this now. Oh, everyone's using that one now. Oh, everyone's and it just feels like it's such a new front that it's like, are we seeing this level of excitement, innovation, and rapid change in any other industry? Obviously, we don't have insights into every industry, but have you noticed any of that, Mike? Because I really haven't. Like, I see AI being added to stuff, but it's always the same stuff. Like, hey, this thing can take notes in meetings. It's like, hey, this thing can answer questions. This thing can make you a meal plan. It's like, I heard about this last year. Like, what else are we doing? This just feels like we are plugged into it. So maybe that's why, but it just feels like such a frontier.
So it is the frontier, and it's the frontier that every major AI company is looking to hit first as the demonstration of, hey, look how disruptive we can be. Most of this AI CEOs have come out and said something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing and misquoting, but developers will no longer be needed in X amount of years. Those years could vary from 1 to 5, from what I've heard. And they're very much specifically saying developers. And that's not a misnaming. That's not them generalizing. That's them being very deliberate with saying like, hey, we're coming for them, and we're going to show you how much we can disrupt that industry. And I guarantee you once and if they do that, they will move more directly onto other industries and try to take over try to be like, hey, next is going to be like finance or something. Like, we're going to replace, X amount of financial analysts in X amount of years. Like, that's going to be their language. I think they're doing developers because they have the most context about it. Like I mentioned before, the first LLM experience that I know of was GitHub Copilot for the general public. And that was a very developer focused one. And they had probably a ton of learning from that. So they have a ton of information, OpenAI especially, because that's who was integrated initially. But they are slowly starting to hit other industries. The other industry that I have noticed is maybe somewhat related, but not really, to coding is tech support. So a lot of these AI chat tech support bubble things, I know personally of quite a few friends that worked as tech support agents inside of, big cell companies, tech support, whatever companies. And over the past 6 months or so, I think at least half of them have either been laid off or affected by it. And affected as in they were in the chat department, and the chat team went from however many to like 2 people, and the rest of it was replaced by the AI chatbots. Now, whether that's premature or not, whether it's working great or not, I've had mixed responses to it. For the most part, I think it's not working that great, but I don't think these companies care. As long as it weeds out the first level of people contacting them in some way, shape, or form, even if they get frustrated out, I don't think they care because they're saving so much money. And second of all, they're kind of making this big bet by laying everyone off, hoping that the next generation of these models will automatically, like, essentially upgrade all their systems anyway. So even if they're not quite there now, 6 months, a year down the line, when they get the next upgrade, it's already going to be 10 times better. And then all the other smaller problems that they have will go away. So I think a lot of companies are making that bet, even with developers. Like, I don't think personally I've seen any sort of AI layoffs yet. I say that with air quotes, but essentially I haven't seen like people, like a department laid off to be replaced by an AI. What I think we've started to see is AI hiring slow down, in the sense that, hey, we have a team of 12 developers, all of a sudden their productivity is up by 50 to 100%. Maybe we don't need to hire an extra 5 developers. We could just, put more onto these developers that have all these AI tools, give them even more AI tools. So I think the hiring slowdown, although some of it's caused by the economy, I think there is some argument to be said that some of these AI tools have started to have an effect on the productivity of developers, increasing it, and therefore having it so that hiring can be slower and not as immediate, and therefore putting a strain on the industry, but not like a, hey, we're going to lay off an entire team and replace it with, an AI bot.
Well, I mean, just speaking from personal experience, I have had experience with another tech company. I'm not going to start naming names, but I have another tech company where I've worked with them with a client. So the client basically just asked me to set up an account for them. They're just not computer savvy at all. So I just went in and just sort of used, it's not even no code. It was like, I was just helping them set up like an account with a service provider. And they were basically like, there was a couple of like little issues where I wasn't able to find anything on Google and I couldn't get these things solved. So I ended up being like, okay, like you are paying for a paid account. You should likely have paid support. Let me go reach out. And I went to go reach out and I went to the chat and the chat was AI. And I kept saying like, hey, like, transfer me to an agent, like this isn't helping me. I need like, it was a legality thing. I need someone to tell me this. This is a legality, like based on jurisdiction thing that no one's talking about. It's like a niche thing. And this thing was like, well, you can't actually, it told me you can't talk to a real person anymore. What you need to do is the only way to do that is you don't chat with them. You send us an email and then we will answer you in due time, which is like a longer ETA, right? Like whatever it is, 72 hours a week, whatever it was. And it's like that was the first time where I was like, oh, because it used to be a person. Like the bot quite literally told me, like, yes, this used to be an area where you could talk to a basic bot for a while, then eventually talk to a person. No longer the case. We now do email support for that stuff. And so what my immediate thought is, oh, all the level 1 or many of the level 1 techs are gone. And that email with the 72 hours, the company said, well, the bot will be the person that weeds things out. And instead of us having a level 1, we'll basically send that email right to level 2 or 3. We'll diminish level 1 and 2 maybe. Level 3 is usually really busy. So that's why we'll have a longer ETA, and the longer ETA will make more people use the bot. And so it's like back and forth, same type of thing. I don't know if that's what they did, but that's the way I can imagine it in my head, where it's like, hey, let's just get rid of these other 2 levels or diminish them to a lower level. And so we don't have as many people vetting things. It's like the bots vetting things. Another thing I do want to mention too, is you mentioned the economy. What's kind of interesting about that is a lot of people don't factor in when they make estimations on tech and other things, is they don't estimate the market too much. Some do, obviously, but some do not. And one thing that I think that a lot of the conversations we're having, us as well as other people, about AI and developers is we're not looking at the market. Let's take a look at the world right now. A lot of tariffs, a lot of debt, a lot of this, a lot of that. If we have a situation break out in which we go into a serious recession, another world financial crisis or whatever, and the companies that are forced financially to lay off their developers, how likely are they, due to the market conditions, to hire on those developers again if the company recovers? Like, let's say the company does ride the wave, they're able to survive they shrink temporarily, but then they come back out. So they kind of like, just like the wave of the economy, where the company is at a high when the economy is at a high, company comes back down, they have to shrink a little bit, then the recession ends and they come back up top. Here's the thing though, during that shrinking, let's say they've laid off a bunch of developers. Are they going to hire new developers, or are they going to start investing in AI tools and getting their managers or whomever is left after the layoffs to then run AI tools? Are they then going to say like, nah, it's maybe like a bit of dirty code, but good enough. And then they're just going to use that. how many people are sincerely going to do that? Because that's a market condition, right? Where it's like, hey, this company maybe would not have considered laying off 100 devs. But if they have to during those hard times, when they come back, even if the company is just as strong, when the economy comes back just as strong, are they going to have 100 devs or are they going to have 10?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a valid concern. I don't think we have the crystal ball to be able to predict it fully. The layoffs in tech have been happening over the last 2 years, regardless of the economy. Like we had, every company that's posted record profits, Facebook, like Meta, Google, Apple on the lesser side of things, but Amazon for sure. Like they've all done massive layoffs, right? Regardless of the economy. Now, with the economy, they'll do more for sure. I would say, like, I think that that's coming in the coming months, where we're going to see even more layoffs coming, and that's going to hurt. Whether we get to a point where they start not hiring developers, maybe, but I still am pretty hesitant to say that production applications don't need them, mostly because most of these production code bases to build new products, maybe like smaller niche products, you might be able to kind of get away with it. These large, really tough code bases, legacy code bases, AI is just not there yet. And whether it's there in the next 2 to 3 years is arguable, just because of the amount of tech debt that's inside of these code bases, to be able to parse all that and put that all into context and do something productive in there. I don't know. Like it's going to be tough. That's more of the pessimistic hat on the AI side of things. But overall, like, we just don't know. We don't have a crystal ball. All we can do is continue forward in trying to become better developers. And part of becoming better developers is not pushing aside AI. It's integrating AI into your workflow as much as allows you to still be a productive developer and write good code. So if you are in the spot where you're like, I don't want to look at AI, I think it's a trendy thing, that, in my opinion, is a huge mistake, because the guy beside you or the girl beside you is going to be looking at AI and becoming a faster developer with it. And when the time comes to look at productivity and to see who's going to be laid off, the person that refuses to use AI and become a faster developer is going to be the one that's probably going to be laid off, realistically. So you need to prepare yourself for that eventuality for sure. Like, it's the same thing with, a new editor, like going from Notepad to VS Code. If you're a developer that's just refusing to make that jump, you're just not going to be as productive unless you're like a, godly developer of some sorts, or you have a completely different workflow than I could possibly imagine. It's possible. But for the most part, the efficiency upgrade that VS Code gives you over Notepad makes you a better, faster, more efficient, less prone to write mistakes developer. And therefore, the person that's mastered that tool and is a good coder is going to beat the good coder that is refusing to use that tool, if that makes sense. Okay, so having said that, Cursor, TLDR, it's VS Code forked with AI very much built inside of it, essentially. I think that's the best way to put it. Like, AI is part of this editor to a very ingrained point of view, makes it really easy to interface with different models. They have many, many different models that they support. They usually, when a model comes out, they'll support it within potentially hours of whenever it comes out for you to try out. It has a pretty competitive pricing strategy. There's a free tier, obviously, with limited usage, a paid tier with more usage, strictly for the AI stuff. I want to be clear. But yeah, that's it for for Cursor and VS Code based editors, I should say, because the next one here we're going to be talking about is NeoVim/Vim, whatever you want, whatever you're using. But this is a completely different type of editor. This is a classic text editor that's built into a terminal, essentially. The GUI is inside of a terminal. So NeoVim especially has a quote unquote GUI, but it's very much terminal centric. So if you've ever used a terminal, you understand that. And sometimes when you npm install something, some really cool stuff comes up. There's even some graphics that can come up. Those are the kind of graphics that you might see in a NeoVim setup that's much more complex. But the point of a NeoVim setup is the speed that it allows. Obviously, terminal is very efficient, very low rendering needed. It's already built into a lot of systems. So you're using really, really low level architecture a lot of times. And it's just super fast. So that's one big reason that people use something like NeoVim. The other big one is that it's built for the keyboard. So just like a terminal, a lot of times you're not really, highlighting things or clicking things. You're doing everything on the keyboard. There's a bunch of different shortcuts and key bindings. And it's the same thing with something like NeoVim. You learn a new method of speeding yourself up by learning all of these shortcuts and key bindings to be able to, go to the end of the line, go to the next file, find a file, switch to a file, check a different file, start one service, stop a service, like essentially everything. If you ever look at something like the Primogen, he's a very good example of a NeoVim Maxi developer. He uses NeoVim a lot. He's a popular streamer for that does coding. When you look at him coding and he shows his hands, he essentially never lifts them up to go to his mouse. He's just quickly typing and just like blah, 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 like it looks kind of like a foreign typing mechanism where you just constantly typing, switching between files really quickly and stuff like that. Well, that took some time to set up, obviously, but that allows him to be very productive, specifically in his typing, right? Like specifically like putting code to paper, whatever you want to call that kind of thing. So that's a really interesting method. In general, I would say, I don't have the stats for this, I wish I did, but I would say that VS Code is probably still more popular due to its accessibility. It's a little bit easier to use. You have a lot of people coming from non-terminal backgrounds into coding, so a lot of people will gravitate towards non-terminal GUI interfaces. And so therefore, it's just an easier ramp up. Therefore, it'll have a wider funnel. And the people that use NeoVim, though, are much more enthusiastic and happy about their NeoVim experience, because most of the time they've invested a lot of time into learning it. There's whole like NeoVim classes you can take essentially, or courses you can take to learn all the key bindings, to learn the right workflows, to install the right extensions and stuff like that, to get yourself productive. And then at that point, once you learn it, you're kind of super invested and also feeling yourself pretty damn productive due to the fact that you just don't have to context switch between mouse and keyboard, that you're going to be quite bought in to the atmosphere, to the environment of NeoVim. Recently, like one of the editors on my team, we were talking about different editors. This is why the episode even came up. And essentially he was like, I'm a NeoVim user. Once you go NeoVim, you don't go back. And that's just the final. And for the most part, anyone that I've ever met that is a NeoVim user, I don't think they've ever switched their editors. And I think most of that is due to, first of all, the investment that it took to get there. And then the next part is like the fact that they are seeing some pretty significant benefits speed up due to the different nature of how it's set up to be able to not context switch, right? So there is some interesting philosophies about how you're kind of doing more with less in a text editor. Having said that, I will say that NeoVim has probably the second most extensions that you can download over, like after VS Code. Everything that you could possibly imagine is built into NeoVim, including AI stuff, right? Like there's plenty of AI autocomplete chats, stuff like that you can bring in as an extension. And that allows you to kind of do whatever the heck you want. And that's a really big positive that people say about NeoVim, is like, there's no real limitation here. The limitation is the steeper learning curve, and everything else is just, I guess the limitation is skill issue, because you need to figure out how to use it. And then everything else you can figure out how to do, because even if the extension doesn't exist for something super specific, it's pretty easy to script it together and create your own.
Well, talking about like Vim and NeoVim, like it reminds me of the days I used to be an administrator for Linux systems, and that's exactly what the goal was that you don't want to be reaching for your mouse. You want to be almost entirely, if not entirely, just using the keyboard. And I mean, the best example that I can think of is if you think about going into Windows and you want to like copy a file, just doesn't matter what it is, maybe a text file from the documents folder to the desktop. Like you can maybe click and drag, you can, click it and then Control C, Control V over at the desktop. You can right click it, do those things. But if you notice, it's a lot of it is mouse and a lot of it is window position. It's like that window can't be full screen if you're clicking and dragging to the desktop, for example. You have to, if you want to go into the Explorer, the File Explorer, Like now with Windows 11, you have tabs. I mean, you could do that, but then you're still clicking over between the tabs. Maybe there's some keyboard shortcuts where you can flip through things and move windows around. Certainly, I'm a Windows user, so I know a lot of the keyboard shortcuts. It definitely helps. But thinking back on those days, I mean, there was nothing like just being able to say like copy this to this, all with a text command, then quickly just like going in and like just right from where I was. Like I didn't have to be opening file explorers, right clicking things, nothing. It was like copy this to this, go here, there, go here. Okay, cat to this, open this up. Okay, change that, enter. Okay, let's reboot now. Let's do this again. Whatever, like reboot that process. Check this, check that, check the status of the copy, check this style sizes, whatever. Like it's definitely a learning curve, 100%. But like if I use Linux today, I do use Linux from the terminal primarily, to the point where I may as well not even have the UI installed, or sometimes I won't have the UI installed because I'm mostly using the terminal. Now, I'm really rusty now. Like it's been a long time since I've had to do that full time, of course, but I have done it here and there, and I still will go to the terminal. I still will go to it. So like going, Vim, NeoVim, whatever, totally makes sense because it is super fast. It's kind of like, other people might be like, yeah, but like, there's these AI tools in this specific GUI or something like that. But the idea is, I mean, I've had this discussion with my friends where they'll be like, well, an M.2 drive is so much faster than an SSD. And I'm like, yeah, but many programs don't use that. Like my start menu can only open so instantly, for example, on Windows, right? It's sort of like if you're someone who's in NeoVim and maybe one of the tools that's in VS Code only is something that is, super revolutionary and this and that, and it saves people 2 minutes. Well, I mean, you're probably saving more than 2 minutes over the course of you coding up a project or editing a couple of files in NeoVim if you really know what you're doing, kind of thing. Like you can only be so instant, you can only be so fast, your thoughts can only go so quickly. And you can only enact on those thoughts so quickly as well. So like that's almost the mentality. Like it almost feels like a religion or something sometimes when people talk about the terminal because they're like so into it. But I don't necessarily absolutely love it, but I do absolutely get it, and I do like how fast it is. The reason why I don't really like it is because there is a lack of feedback. There is a lack of being like, hey, where did that file go? Now you don't remember, things like that. And there is a little bit of that, like we'll just remember or just like check or just whatever. If you are new, it is a very steep learning curve. I haven't used Vim or NeoVim, but I have absolutely, like I said, used Bash and all that. And it is absolutely a learning curve.
Yeah, exactly. Like I try to use Vim every once in a while. Like most of the time when I'm editing Bash configs or something like that, I'll try to do that in Vim rather than opening up like a editor for that, just to keep myself refreshed on, the :WQ stuff, like how to save files, how to insert files, how to transverse a file. Like I like that aspect of it for whatever reason, but I haven't done enough to really go deep into trying to set it up as my code editor. Now, I have got good opportunity now. One of the developers I'm working with, they have a full NeoVim setup working with our code base. So what I'll probably do is I'll have them teach me how they set it up and try to kind of mimic their setup just to see, because I'm curious if it'll make me faster. My anticipation, though, unfortunately, is because I'm trying to try out these new AI tools and using them a little bit more and just spending more time thinking on my code rather than writing right away. I don't know if writing faster is the thing that's bottlenecking me. I think it's more just like the architecture side of things, like thinking of it from a high level. And I don't know if a code editor really will do anything for me in speeding me up. So that's my hesitation. I still think I want to try it because of the fact that like it just looks cool, honestly, like to just never have to touch the mouse. That kind of feels and looks cool. So I want to I want to try it. I'm a nerd. I want to try that. But overall, I don't know if it's going to be that revolutionary experience that other people have. But I'll report back. If you want to know more, I'll probably when I try it, I'll definitely report on X and maybe Blue Sky or something like that. I'm on HTML everything on X. I think Mike K on Blue Sky, but regardless, like I'll definitely be reporting about it and talk to everyone about it. If you're interested in trying it out and want to chat, definitely reach out to me on there. Having said that, we can move on to the next one here, which is the one I have least information about and least usage of, is WebStorm. So WebStorm is very similar, I would say, to Visual Studio, not Visual Studio Code, but Visual Studio. It's a very feature-packed editor, specifically tailored this one to JavaScript and front-end development, right? It's specifically tailored for the web, so that's why it's more of a recommendation than Visual Studio. But it is very much that same, like, everything's built in, right? Like, you really almost never have to reach for an extension because you have your code refactoring built in, your debugging built in, all your testing tools are already built into your editor. It had smart code completion, like it had really good IntelliJ autocomplete way before we had LLMs. So it's a really big, robust platform for you to be able to have not the autocomplete we have now, but beforehand when there was just contextually aware autocomplete, like when you start typing a word, if it has that word in its database, it'll start autocompleting for you in a way that it knows like the function that you're in and stuff like that. So like it was a really smart way to implement autocomplete. I'm sure they have some AI tools now. I haven't checked, to be fair. I'm sure they've implemented that, but that was a differentiating feature back then before LLMs came out. And then it has like a really good Git editor in there, some build tools, all like a bunch of framework support, like a ton of features built in. And it's still, from my understanding, pretty fast for having this much built in, because it's like it's not JavaScript based. It's like built with real technology, like real efficient technology. So like it is a good editor. I think it's still a good editor. I think where it falls short a little bit, number one, I don't think they don't have a community license. I believe you can get a cheaper or a free student license, but that's it. And then you have to pay for a license if you're a regular developer. So I think that limits the amount of people that can get into it. Like all the other ones that I mentioned either have they're all completely free with additional add-ons you can put on for AI, right? Like in VS Code, you can pay for more GitHub Copilot usage. In Cursor, you can pay for more AI autocomplete stuff. But overall, they're free. Like you download them, you use them right away. WebStorm's not that way. It is paid. And it's also a little bit weird in its how people perceive it. So a lot of times it's a little bit behind in supporting latest technologies. So from my understanding, it still has like issues with like support for Svelte and support for Vue. You'll have really good support for React, which is the top technology, but it'll have like random crashes in those other two sometimes. So it just has weird little caveats supporting features outside of its core base, right? Like it knows the core stuff because it has a development team that builds for it. But because it's not community driven, like community people don't create extensions for it, it's therefore limited to whatever developers are working on it at that time. So that makes it a little bit harder to use if you're using something outside of the norm standard stuff.
Is this something like, is there a very specific reason why you would use this? Like this sounds just from how you're presenting it, it sounds like, a plugin that was forgotten on like WordPress or something, and the person kind of shows up and occasionally updates it for like the new WordPress version, but is not really listening to like new features or anything like that. Like what is this? Is this like an old hat IDE or anything like that?
It's older, but that's not to say that it's not. It's still pretty used in production, and it's still being updated as we speak. Like I'm just on their website right now. They've since I've looked at it. Obviously, they have an AI assistant built in, so that was true what I said. It's a pro feature, so it's like a feature on top of your whatever purchase price you have. And then it also has a free non-commercial use license now, which it didn't have before. So they are trying to compete with that. They're trying to be more there. And again, like I said, they do have a little bit of a performance advantage in some cases because they're built with more native technologies versus like a JavaScript engine running in the background. So they are a little bit faster. Where I've seen them used the most is in massive corporations that want to roll out an editor that has really specific standards and really specific tooling for a specific project. It's a little bit easier to work with in those capacities. And so, a corporation will go and buy an enterprise license, distribute it among their developers, and then they'll be forced to use this with whatever configuration is provided.
Very fleetable, basically.
Very fleetable. Yeah, exactly. Now, having said that, VS Code is very fleetable now. They've built all that tooling up. I don't know if it's on the same level as WebStorm, but it is very fleetable. I've seen it fleeted many, many times in successful ways. But that's where I've seen the most like usage is like a corporation just gets sold a license and they push it on their developers. That's it. Okay, so WebStorm, it's a pretty popular one. Again, like there's not much I could say about it, positive, negative. It's more something you could just try, and you can try it now for free, which is great. So give it a shot and see if you like it. The last one I want to talk about before we end today is Zed. Zed is a newcomer, probably the newest out of the ones I mentioned. It is a Rust-based code editor. So it was built in Rust, which means it's very, very fast. Out of all of these, other than NeoVim, because NeoVim doesn't have a UI, Zed is definitely the fastest. It is, I've used it myself for an extended period of time. It is stupidly fast. Everything loads instantaneously. So it's, in my opinion, the best way to describe it is if you want NeoVim-like performance and a GUI on top of it, Zed is probably the best bet. And it has stuff built into it. I believe it has a terminal built in. I think it has Git built in now, so it has Git functionality, being able to do pull, like committing, cloning, all of that. That wasn't built in early on when I was using it, but it is there now. It is open source as well, so there is some community support, and I was able to use some extensions, which is cool. It had some extensions. It has some AI built in with extensions also, like making it more usable. The AI, when I was using it, was very rudimentary. It was very much probably a step below VS Code or GitHub Copilot. I don't know how it is now. I haven't used it in a few months, but essentially, yes, it was there, and you were able to augment it a little bit with the extensions. So I don't think that that's going to be a huge issue. Where the biggest issue I ran into is like support for smaller, again, frameworks and stuff. So the Svelte support was very much there, but very, very, very rudimentary. It didn't have all the syntax highlighting that I was used to was very much stripped down. It had some weird mistakes. It wasn't keeping up with the Svelte version. There was just some like little discrepancies that caused me to be like, I don't know if I want to use this. When I was using it before, it didn't have the Git integration that VS Code has that I like. So that was another thing that I didn't want to deal with, having to use the CLI only. I kind of augment my CLI with the UI. So like, I like it, and I like what they're trying to do, because especially the performance is unbelievably good, like super fast, stupidly fast. My hesitation is that if I wanted the performance, I'd probably still just go to NeoVim, because it has a more robust like extension marketplace anyway. So like you get the performance plus the extensions. Yes, it's a little bit harder to learn, so the learning curve on NeoVim is way more than Zed. But if I really cared about performance, I would go that route anyway. Like it's not impossible. Like you could still learn it. So that's where I find Zed to be kind of just on the outside of something I would fully recommend, due to it's like very new. So it's going to have some edge cases that it doesn't support, or something, or some stuff that doesn't work. And because of the fact that it doesn't have the market penetration, the community support isn't quite as high as something like NeoVim, or especially VS Code, it's a tough recommendation. It is really cool to play around with. I highly recommend you at least try it out, just to see the difference in speed versus VS Code. I think it's really cool to see them side by side and be like, it's the same file I'm opening. How is this so much faster at opening it? And it's because it's using Rust instead of JavaScript. Rust is inherently a much, much, much lower level language than JavaScript is. So it's essentially just a binary that runs right on top of your metal.
The first thing I thought of when you mentioned Zed is Pulp Fiction. I'm going to be honest. I've never heard of this IDE at all. Never seen it or anything. But just immediately just went to Pulp Fiction, and yeah. That's my only comment on it. I've never seen this one. Never heard about it. Interesting to learn, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not on Windows, so that's probably one of the main reasons.
There you go.
They have a roadmap saying Windows when, and they're working on it. So they're working on Windows, but it's not on Windows yet. They don't have vibe coding yet. Like they don't have like an agent that can go in and do stuff like Cursor and VS Code can, and they don't have a debugger. So like they have like some pretty big deficiencies compared to a VS Code. But I have another person on my team that swears by Zed. They just love it because of the speed and simplicity. And it has all the features that they need, so it's one of those things.
I mean, at the end of the day, like, I mean, we've mentioned, like, I mean, maybe not Notepad regular, but Notepad++ you could even, use if you really wanted to. Although, I mean, Notepad, I believe now has AI writing, or at the very least it's coming. It's like Copilot AI rewrite or whatever is coming. And Notepad it has, I mean, it has tabs and stuff like that, but it is too simplistic. Like there's no, as far as I understand, there's absolutely no way to get syntax highlighting going in there. I do use Notepad quite a bit to like quickly clean text or whatever, or quickly jot something down. But I feel like that's where it's supposed to be. That's where it's most used. I use it for like if I need to like write a complex email back, or if I need to like write a complex like Slack message back. It's like maybe I'll draft it in there and then I can copy paste it because it's clean text. Then I can like reformat it wherever it needs to be, stuff like that. I do the same thing a little bit in Notepad++, but at least Notepad++ has the syntax highlighting. Like I feel like the syntax highlighting is something that is like so ergonomic that
Yeah.
no one that I know, and no one that I think, well, I don't know, maybe someone listening to the show, like let us know, like hates it. Like maybe you just hate colored syntax. Because well, actually there's a question. So like, is it colored in various colors that are good for people who are colorblind? Like, are there modes for color? Because I know there's
Oh
like in
yeah.
video games, there's like accessibility settings where it's like I'm this type of colorblind, and it'll change the colors up.
Themes. There's like 1,000 different themes on VS Code, or thousands, I should say, that all the ranges, one range of being like anti-colorblind themes, where like it's specifically
What?
designed against colorblind people, and one range to the fully colorblind supported themes. Like there's themes everywhere in between that spectrum. So yeah, you can customize that syntax highlighting however you want.
I just imagined like an app store, but it's all the VS Code themes, and
Yeah.
there's literally like a thing. It's like if you hate colorblind people, and then it just has like a slider of all the different like check out this one, look. Like it's like instead of having good contrast, this one has bad contrast. Instead of like people who can't see yellow or something, we just specifically use everything as yellow. Like it's like why? Why would you have this? Like this is just silly at this point.
There are silly themes though. Like there are themes that will make everything like neon blue and yellow and green. Like, and I think a lot of that is just like tongue in cheek, obviously. Like people are just fucking around and posting it. But I bet you there's someone that uses it and they're like, I like to get my eyes burnt. No problem.
You know what? You know what would be awesome is if in amongst your team you did like whenever you guys had to share a screen, the goal was to always one up each
Yeah.
other with a ridiculous theme. So it's like, okay, check this out, and it's just like a cat theme or something where every time you click it like meows and stuff like that. It'd be absolutely ridiculous. Actually, it's a very small off topic but kind of on topic again story. There was a guy who was trying to hand in a report, and this was not in my class. This was in one of my buddy's classes, and it was the first year. So I was in the computer course. He was in I think it was like TV broadcasting. But anyway, this guy was supposed to like hand in his resume. And so he made it on like WordPerfect or some sort of word processor at home. And then he brought it to the school. And I was in the computer lab. So I was like invited in there, and I was just kind of hanging out, and I was doing my work, they were doing theirs. And this guy showed up, and he accidentally, or he didn't accidentally, he imported his resume so that he could print it at school. And I guess the formatting messed up really bad and put a cat border around his resume. And no matter what he did, he couldn't get rid of it. And it was due. So he handed in his resume with a cat border. And I think I wasn't there again, but I think the teacher may have made special note during the class, like, hey, like we're not supposed to be having like themed borders on our on our professional looking resumes. A bit of a disaster, but
Christ. Yeah, that's great. Jeez.
imagine being like the guy who's like, man, we're gonna have like a nice professional day, and then he just a nice professional like set of resumes to mark here, and it's like, what? It's a cat border? Like you have Clippy in the corner or something ridiculous. But I think unless we have anything else to add, I think that ends this episode.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Alrighty, well, remember, if you want to support episodes like this, you can do so on Patreon. That's patreon.com/html, all the things. Check out the tiers, give that a go. Many thanks to our $3 tier patrons: Tim from the Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se, Syntaxify from the HTML All the Things Discord server, and Stacy Mostler from the website swoonworthydesigns.com. We also like to give a shout out to Michael Araka, a contributing author on HTMLallthethings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. Feel free to leave a comment or review on the platform that you are listening to this on, and this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things Podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.